Geoff Emberling. Dr. Geoff Emberling is an archaeologist and museum curator who specializes in the ancient cultures of the Middle East and the Nile Valley, and particularly on urbanization, social identities, including ethnicity, and more recently on developing post-colonial archaeological practices, something very, very important today. He received his BA from Harvard College in anthropology, our own anthro department, and wrote a senior thesis on the iconography of carved stone vessels from southern Iran. And later he received his PhD from the departments of anthropology and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan, writing a dissertation on ethnicity in early Mesopotamia, a study that was based in part on a collection of ceramic vessels from southwestern Iran that are now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. He's worked as assistant curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, during which time he also directed excavations at the early urban site of Tel Brak in northeastern Syria. His excavations there focused on the emergence of the city in the 4th millennium BCE, its conquest by people from southern Mesopotamia, and its reemergence as the center of a regional kingdom in the 3rd millennium. After the stint at the Metropolitan, he worked as museum director and chief curator at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where he oversaw the installation of the Nubian Gallery. Here's where we get towards our lecture topic for tonight. And he launched a successful series of special exhibits there as well. His research on the Nubian Gallery, or for the gallery, led to directing a salvage archaeological project in Northern Sudan. This was in an area that is now flooded by construction of a dam at the 4th Cataract. Now based at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan, he started an archaeological project in northern Sudan at the site of Al-Kuru, the burial place of the kings and queens of ancient Kush, who conquered Egypt and ruled as its 25th dynasty. And beginning in 2020, skipping ahead, he will begin a new project at Jebel Barkal, one of the capital cities of ancient Kush, that's also the center of one of Sudan's 2 UNESCO World Heritage Areas. And for us, it's a distinct privilege to follow this work, as both of these Kushite sites, Al-Kuru and Jebel Barkal, were first excavated, as you'll learn tonight, by our own Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition. So let's see how our legacy has now been augmented and enhanced by Geoff Emberling's recent work. Geoff.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for the kind invitation to speak and for the kind introduction. Peter and I have had a chance to talk numerous times about George Reisner and his records, and be interested to see how this relates to your understanding of that past. Although I hasten to say that this is not a lecture about George Reisner. It's really about how we have developed archaeological practice in Sudan since then. So tonight I'm going to talk about a range of subjects: archaeology and museums, heritage and communities. And all of this is rooted in the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in a small community in northern Sudan over the past 6 years. I'm going to suggest that we have an opportunity now to reconsider what archaeology is about and who it is for. I begin with the observation that archaeology is fundamentally a colonial discipline. I'm not saying, if that makes any of you uncomfortable, that all archaeologists are imperialists, but the field unquestionably came into being during colonial times. This means that the foundations of archaeology are imbued with the values of colonialism, by which I mean a basic orientation to extraction of objects in the early days and of information today. A basic lack of interest in the experience of local communities where we work. Fundamental inequalities between archaeologists and local populations. A value placed on discovery, the idea of uncharted territory. The search for the source of the Nile in the mountains of East Africa in the 19th century is a good example of a colonial research project. The entire project depends on disregarding local knowledge. Were there not Ethiopians or Sudanese who had a good idea of where the Nile started? The fundamental asymmetry is shown by the fact that there was no search for the source of the Thames, say, by Africans. It was, in some ways, unthinkable. So it was the imperial system that provided a worldview in which knowledge of foreign lands could be considered essential and even natural. A related institution also rooted in colonialism is the museum, particularly the grand national museums in Paris, London, and later in Berlin that collected archaeological treasures from areas of colonial interest. American museums, of course, started a little bit later and had somewhat different motivations, mainly catching up to Europe, I would say, in terms of collection and prestige. The fact that archaeology museums have colonial origins doesn't make them bad, I would argue, but it does mean that it's time for us to reconsider what we in those fields do, how we do it, and why. So the question that motivates my talk today and the work that I'm reporting on is, how can or should we modify archaeology in a post-colonial, globalized world? In many ways, the default practice of archaeology has not changed since the 19th century, and I say this knowing that there are excellent examples of more progressive projects working in the Middle East and North Africa, which are the areas I know best. But I would say that the field's default still has not yet changed. Here's how it works. We go to an archaeological site or region, we gather data, we return home, having had only the bare minimum of interaction with the people who live in the area, and even often with national authorities. Similarly, the ways that members of the general public understand archaeological practice has also not changed, particularly in its overemphasis on discovery. It's always, what did you find, rather than what are you learning, to say nothing of, tell us about your experiences with the local community. In 2014, I did a film with National Geographic on our work that was entitled, in the end, Rise of the Black Pharaohs. It was an eye-opening experience. I realized how little control over the tone of the film I had, even though I had been the one to propose it to National Geographic. And it also reinforced, in 1,000 different ways, how essential the trope of discovery is to the presentation of archaeology for general audiences. But I would argue that change is coming. And to return to museums for a moment, another one of those colonial institutions, museums now provide part of a model for how archaeology needs to change. Exhibit development, and this is also controversial probably to a different group of people in the audience, that is people who work in museums. Exhibit development in museums in recent times has moved toward what is called visitor-centered approaches. In the words of one museum commentator, museums are moving from being about something to being for somebody. I'm sorry, I've lost my place. That is, they prioritize the communities for which the museum matters in ways that have not been done in the past. I would argue that this is a good model for how archaeology needs to change in order to remain relevant in a global world. That is, we should consider which people we are working for, both locally and internationally. And for the continued vitality of archaeology as a field, I would argue that this means we're not just working for purely academic knowledge. Making a change to consider our audiences also has some unexpected benefits to more traditional archaeological practice. This approach to archaeology is often called public archaeology or community archaeology, and it engages with heritage, which you could define as the ways that people think about their own past. And this, of course, in itself is not as straightforward as we might be inclined to assume. Okay, now we can get on to slides. My own archaeological field project at Al-Kuru in Northern Sudan began as a straightforward, old-fashioned archaeological research project, and over the last 6 years has become a heritage project that I would argue is fully engaged with the local community. I want to outline the steps that led us in this direction and talk about what this has meant for our archaeological project as well as for people in Al-Kuru. One more bit of introduction. Archaeological talks invariably begin with the site, ruins, monuments, and history, rather than with the people who live in the place that we are working. This sets up a dynamic that is alienating to archaeologists, even if we don't realize it, as well as to visitors to the site who are both empowered to pretend that local people aren't there. It's also alienating, of course, to local people themselves. So I'm going to begin tonight, not with the site, but with the place and the people who live there. Al-Kuru itself is a village of about 3,000 people, located about 400 kilometers north of Khartoum. People who live in Al-Kuru today are mostly Shaigia, an Arabic-speaking Muslim ethnic group. That is, note I'm not using the term tribe because that is also, in much of Africa, considered an unpleasant colonial overtone. The Shaigia's documented history extends back to the 16th century when they established their independence from a regional power known as the Funj Sultanate of Sennar. Shaigia genealogies, however, trace their descent even further back to an ancestor named Shaig, who came from Arabia as early as the 7th century CE. Place names and local Arabic dialect, however, make it clear that much of the population is descended from that of the medieval kingdom of Makuria, a Christian kingdom speaking a language called Nubian, even if there may also have been some immigration from Arabia. I should also note that while scholars and non-specialists, if they know about this area at all, tend to know it as Nubia, but that is a Greek term derived from an ethnic group known as the Noba, who inhabited the area in the 3rd century BCE. The local ancient name for this region was Kush. So the archaeological site, now turning to that, at Al-Kuru was first located by the Royal Prussian expedition of Richard Lepsius in 1844. But it was first excavated and brought to international attention by George Reisner, who excavated the site on behalf of Harvard and the Museum of Fine Arts in 1918 and 1919. Reisner discovered that the kings and queens of ancient Kush buried there included most of the kings who conquered and ruled over Egypt as its 25th dynasty from roughly 750 to 650 BCE. And Reisner brought most of the material back to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I personally hope that the museum will find a way to put this material back on permanent display before too much longer. Because of Reisner's work, the Museum of Fine Arts has the world's finest collection of art from ancient Nubia. The development of the Al-Kuru cemetery is, at this point, a standard part of the archaeology and history of ancient Kush, and so let me sketch it here. What Reisner found was a sequence of tombs that began with traditional Nubian burial mounds that he called tumuli, that's the term that we use, in this part of the cemetery, and moved on to increasingly Egyptian forms of burial. Enclosure walls were added around the tumuli. Little chapels were built out in front, and then from rounded forms we moved to rectangular forms. The exact form of these burials is debated to a certain extent, whether they were benches or pyramids. But with the arrival of the tombs of the first kings who conquered Egypt, as the 25th Dynasty, we get true pyramid burials with underground substructures. The cemetery is also, so this development of this cemetery traces this interesting history between Kush and Egypt, in which the Kushite kings were progressively and selectively adopting aspects of elite Egyptian culture for their own purposes of rule and legitimation. The cemetery is also interesting for its spatial layout, and one of Harvard's graduate students, Kate Rose, who's been a member of my team at Al-Kuru, is working on this question and related questions about the spatial layout of these cemeteries. But I'll just point out here that with the arrival of the 25th Dynasty, the queens were buried in their own separate area of the cemetery. Also off the map up here were some horse burials. Each of the kings of the 25th Dynasty had a team of horses buried facing away from his pyramid in a aspect of burial practice that's whose meaning is a little bit opaque to us. And just to show some of the objects that were recovered, all of these tombs were extensively looted. All of them were looted. But nevertheless, Reisner recovered a number of objects, in some cases, including this very first burial, fine objects that give some hint of the fact that even the initial tumulus was itself a highly elite burial. The objects left around the later tombs include these beautiful pieces now in the Museum of Fine Arts, whose craftsmanship is essentially Egyptian, but who show this hybrid quality in which some of the themes themselves are Nubian or Kushite. The most famous king buried at Al-Kuru was certainly Pianki. We'll talk more about Pianki later. His victory stela that you see in a drawing here describes his conquest of Egypt in about 715 BCE. Two of the tombs at Al-Kuru preserve painted decoration, and this tells us more about this program of selective adoption of Egyptian forms. This is the burial of one of the queens, Queen Kalhata, and you can see that among other things, this represents the adoption of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. It also represents the adoption of Egyptian funerary spells, and when these are mapped out in detail, they show an interesting pattern. So Egyptian funerary spells, you will know the Book of the Dead. This is a later version of Egyptian funerary spells. There are earlier versions of these spells, and the rulers at Al-Kuru in their painted tombs adopted from all periods of Egyptian history: Old Kingdom pyramid texts, Middle Kingdom coffin texts, and New Kingdom spells from the Book of the Dead. And this represents the idea that they were trying to position themselves as the inheritors of Egyptian ritual traditions. And this went pretty far, in fact, but there were some things that they were not going to do. They were not going to get into removing organs out of their bodies for burial. That is, true mummification was not practiced. And they also retained the traditional regional tradition of burial as if the dead were sleeping. And in these elite tombs, this took the form of burial on beds, a non-Egyptian funerary practice. So that is just to say that the Nubian rulers, the rulers of Kush, were not simply adopting everything about Egypt. They were picking and choosing the features that worked within their local tradition. Okay. So here is a local map of here's Al-Kuru. And a series of other sites. Al-Kuru is part of the ancient heartland of the dynasty, of the capital of the dynasty of Kush, that included the temple center at Jebel Barkal, an administrative center at the site of Sanam, a later pyramid cemetery at the site of Nuri, and in addition to being an ancient center, these sites all together make up a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, called Jebel Barkal and the sites of the Napatan region. There are currently two archaeological projects working at Al-Kuru. One, which I co-direct with Rachel Dan of the University of Copenhagen, has aimed to provide broader archaeological and historical context for the royal burials. And a second, directed by Abbas Sid Ahmed Muhammad Ali, who you see there on the left, who is a Sudanese archaeologist who grew up in the village of Al-Kuru. And his project is aimed to protect the site and prepare it for a clearer presentation for visitors. So let me now talk about the steps that led me unsuspectingly, in a way, from a very traditional archaeological research project toward a community-engaged heritage project at Al-Kuru. So my initial goal in my project was to investigate the possibility that there was some traces of a royal city around the cemetery. That would make sense, right? That a cemetery wouldn't just exist in isolation. And there were some hints in Reisner's field diaries. Here they are, drawings of structures that he found scattered around the site that suggested there could be a royal settlement. And you can see some temples, a rock-cut well, a town wall and gate, and a portion of a fortification wall. Reisner's diaries were frustrating in this regard because they didn't indicate where these things were located. They didn't indicate, in most cases, what scale they were at, what they were made of. And so in approaching this question, it was challenging even to know where to begin. And as far as relations with the community were concerned, my hope was just that we would kind of get along with the local community. We hoped that that was the extent of my ambition there. So a combination of luck, funding, and personal relationships have led us to a much more robust and satisfying field practice. Okay. So in trying to locate these finds, we tried the full range of archaeological tools, high-tech, multispectral satellite imagery that we thought might be able to show us where ancient remains were buried, careful topographic survey that might reveal mounds and things like that. We used geophysics, magnetometry, which is a technique to investigate subsurface remains. And honestly, we had almost no luck. We didn't find any of these structures. We asked people in the village, and initially they took us to places out in the palm groves where they thought they had seen something once. And all of those ended up being, not wild goose chases exactly, but not these structures and not very archaeologically interesting. It turned out that it took some time, not surprisingly, it took some time for us to gain their trust. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but it turned out that the older people in the village did know exactly where some of these structures were located. One older man even came and drew the exact plan of that rock-cut well with its staircase that you see on the lower left in the sand. He said, yeah, did it look like this? It's right over there. So it turned out that developing trust and asking people in this particular case was the best way to locate these ancient remains. So here's what we found. A town wall and gate, and there you see just the central portion of it. We were able to trace the wall, the entire extent of the wall from one corner to the other as it faced the Nile. Beautiful structure. We found the rock-cut well. In order to excavate this, we had to destroy the courtyard wall of one of the houses in the village, and their response to this, after we assured them that we would pay them to have it rebuilt, was to bring us coffee every morning. It's very nice. And here we have just a little indication of one corner. Reisner had been there before, so it was not particularly rewarding to excavate this. So we went through the plastic bag level and the cassette tape level, and then we got down to the early 20th century, but we didn't get any older stuff than that. We found both of the funerary temples that Reisner had excavated, and you can see in I have to explain this drawing a little bit. There's a plan view and then a section view, and that weird little cross-hatching means that the stuff is underground, cut into the rock. So you see there's a kind of a diagonal passageway, there's a big courtyard, and then there's two rooms that are entirely underground. So the pictures here show the diagonal passageway, the big open courtyard, and then one of the underground chambers with its kind of vaulted roof, just cut into the sandstone. We also found his larger funerary temple. And here, Reisner's plan doesn't show the full complexity. He shows two chambers with built stone walls, some of the walls being cut into the rock. We also found, as you can see, two doorways cut into the rock there, and those led to an entire network of underground rooms, which we were able to clear. We also, finally, excavated Kurru Pyramid 1, which was the largest pyramid at the site. And it turned out from a reading of Reisner's notes and publications that he had not completely excavated this pyramid. So this was an exciting opportunity for us to excavate this. It turned out in the end, I could give you a whole story about this. It's quite an experience, I would say, to dig a pyramid. That's not something that every archaeologist gets a chance to do. We estimated that we removed 300 tons of dirt by hand from the fill of this pyramid over 2.5 seasons of work. And when we got into the burial chamber at the back of the pyramid, we found this, what you can see here, a bench, a 10-foot long slab of granite lying on top of it, and nothing else. So this is a little bit of a historical mystery, but the things that I can tell you about it for sure are that this pyramid was almost but not quite finished. It was never used for a royal burial. They stopped at the moment before they set up the granite slab and carved the name of the king in it. It's too bad that they stopped just before that rather than just after that. So that's a whole other story, but that it completes our summary of what we had excavated. And if you haven't read between the lines yet, that means that our quest to find a royal city was a complete failure. We found a lot of stuff, but none of it came together to form anything like a royal city that was contemporary with this, the royal burials. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the development of heritage connections. So many archaeological projects assume that local communities will have, or that they should develop, heritage connections with local archaeological monuments. And archaeologists often hope to foster these connections in part so that the local communities will help us in the work of protecting those monuments. That would be convenient, right? So that idea, I would argue, has a neo-colonial aspect to it. It does not grant that local communities have agency or might have their own ideas about sites and what they mean. And in fact, when our project started, local people did not particularly feel a connection to ancient Kush. In Sudan today, the community that asserts a heritage connection to ancient Kush are the modern Nubian ethnic group. Shaigia tend not to make that connection because of ruptures in the historical tradition, the switch from Christianity to Islam, and from Nubian to the Arabic language, and because of their own origin story that has them arriving from the Arabian Peninsula. But even if we were very careful not to impose our own idea of heritage on the local community, nevertheless, the idea of a connection grew during the process of our excavation. So I could have put this image before, but as we were filming this film, let me just stop with a little interesting aside about this title. At different points, this film has been available on YouTube. I can never keep track of when the permissions have lapsed and when they seem to keep putting restrictions on it. But the comments about the film are all there on YouTube. And some of them are just hateful, just about the title, about how racist the title is. Why would that be exactly? Well, so it's because when you say black pharaohs, that suggests that some pharaohs were not black, that is, some pharaohs were not African, that this represents a kind of an appropriation actually of Egypt from people of African heritage. Anyway, that was not our intention in making this movie. I didn't want to have a whole bunch of people hating me. And in fact, the title was not mine. It's a commonly used sort of marketing term. Anyway, so during the filming of this documentary, we had our local foreman named Mansour Muhammad Ahmed, who's become a good friend of mine. And as you can see, a style leader in the local community. The Egyptian, so I really didn't want to impose my idea of heritage connections on the local community. So as we were filming, the Egyptian cameraman asked Mansour in Arabic what he thought about this work of his ancestors. My entire project was ruined, I thought, in that moment. But Mansour had just a great answer, and I'm going to quote him. Here's what he said. These are my ancestors. My culture and my civilization comes from them. I'm a part of them. We're very late. We should have been looking and learning from them a long time ago. I just thought that was, I mean, he had no time to prepare this, but he just had this very eloquent response to this, that we're now recognizing that there is a kind of a heritage connection. So the next step for us was a community meeting in 2015 in which we screened the film, and I talked about the work that we were doing to a group of about 100 local people, mostly men, well, you can't really see it in this picture, but it's called the Upper Kuru Club. It's the local men's club. I myself, as I was preparing for this, was worried about what the community would say about the fact that most of the material found at Al-Kuru was now in the Museum of Fine Arts. But in fact, they were much more interested in the bones of the kings, particularly Pianki, who remains a national hero in Sudan today for his great work in conquering Egypt. So when I said that the tombs had been looted in antiquity and the bones of the kings had basically been scattered all around the royal cemetery and mostly decayed to tiny fragments, the local men said, "Oh, so you mean we've been carrying them around in our buckets as we've been excavating?" So they turned from really prepared to be quite angry to quite irreverent immediately. They also had their own interesting questions, and I'll just highlight one of them here, and that was about skin color. Did I think that the ancient Kushites were lighter or darker skinned than the people in Al-Kuru right now? I had to say this was not one of my research questions. But they had their own idea about this. They thought that since they had Arab blood, as suggested by their Shaigia origin story, that they must have been lighter skinned than the Kushites. It's quite a complicated question, all in all, and all I could say was I really don't know. So both of those conversations about Pianki's bones and about the question of skin color suggested that there were heritage engagements with antiquity in the village, just not the ones we had expected. There's also an interesting one. I hadn't planned to talk about this, but I'll just mention because it's interesting. There's a local story about the daughters of the sheikh, of a religious figure who had lived in the village in the 19th century. They're called the Banat sheikh. And these 7 daughters are said by people in the village to appear to them in visions, to help, to hinder, but they're definitely spirits that need to be appeased. And they can particularly be appealed to by women who are seeking fertility. And interestingly enough, oddly enough, the place where offerings to the Banat sheikh are made is in the back dirt from the excavation of one of the Kushite queens. So there are all these little holes in this pile of back dirt with little offerings put in them. So again, a different kind of heritage engagement with the ancient antiquities. So I'm going to highlight 2 more nudges in the direction of community archaeology. The first is the major funding offered by the government of Qatar for archaeological projects in Sudan. It's a wonderful but also surprising development in archaeology in the region. They have supported around 40 projects over the past 5 years, as well as funding a project to reinstall the National Museum, something like $130 million in all. And they have just announced plans for a second round of funding for some of these projects. It turns out this funding is actually aimed at tourism development in Sudan rather than archaeological research. They will support some archaeological research, but it has to result in a presentation of the site for visitors. This funding was given without particular instructions to all the field projects about how we should go about developing a visitor center. And in fact, projects have taken a wide range of approaches, but it got us at Al-Kuru thinking about ways to talk with the community. So the second of these nudges was my contacts with a group of scholars at the African Studies Center at the University of Michigan. So this is a gathering of people who work on different aspects of heritage across Africa with a range of different practical applications, particular strengths in work in Ghana and in South Africa. So they're not archaeologists mostly, so they had some quite interesting and useful perspectives on this. And we were able to have some of them come to Al-Kuru in 2016. To help us facilitate, ask questions in conversations with the community about heritage. Here's a conversation that we had with some community leaders. There's Mansour with a different turban style, looking good as always, and with local school teachers. So these were not conversations narrowly focused on the archaeological site, but broader conversations around heritage. So a key question emerged in these conversations. We asked them, would you like visitors to the archaeological site to learn something about your village and about your culture? Because as it is now, that's not how the whole thing is set up. You show up, you want to visit the tombs, you go into the tombs, and then you leave, and there's just you don't talk to anybody locally, and again, that's that alienation cycle that I had talked about. So I wasn't sure how they were going to respond to this, because this is a fairly conservative, in many ways, fairly conservative Muslim village. And the answer could have been no. We actually don't want to deal with a whole bunch of foreign tourists. But instead, their answer was a very enthusiastic yes, especially if visitors would be able to eat local food. And they were especially excited about the pancakes with savory sauces that they make that are called gurasa. And here you see a plate of them there. And interestingly, I think this is also an important part of the way that archaeologists talk about this. We often tend to assume that the interest of local communities is going to be financial, primarily. That if we can promise them that this is going to make them money, that's going to result in greater local engagement. But all of this conversation went on without any discussion of how this would benefit them financially. So with all those little nudges in this direction, we began making plans, not for a visitor center exactly, but for a community heritage center. So it's an important difference in emphasis. And this would present not just information about the archaeological site, but would present information about local culture in a way that they were excited about. We archaeologists have been excited about this because we've loved living in this beautiful little village on the Nile, and we've enjoyed getting to know local people and culture. So we're happy that this knowledge and experience can be shared in some small way with visitors. One idea that came up for the exhibits in the Heritage Center was to have local people document and present the village and their lives through photos. So we sponsored in 2 successive years a photo contest. That is, people in the village had a year to take pictures. They could submit, the rules change from year to year, but they could submit photos. We put together a committee of foreigners and locals to judge them. 10 winners were selected. We showed all the entries in the Upper Kuru Men's Club. and after extensive consultation, chose a series of winners. And here are some of the winners of local photos from 2017. So the idea was that we would have them take pictures so that visitors to the site would see the village, local culture through the eyes of local people. And there's obviously, they are editing in some ways, but they're also presenting the side of their culture that they're most excited about sharing. And then after the contest, we interviewed all of the winners so that and asked them what were they thinking about these photos, so that their words would also be a part of the presentation in the Heritage Center. So this is super simple, but really exciting. The second year we did this, word really got around, and I think we had 300 people, and a lot of women crammed into this the Al-Kuru club to look at the at the slides. We also identified one young man locally, Hamoud Ibrahim, who entirely on his own, it happened to be right across from the house that we rent in the village for the excavation, he made a museum of local culture. So he just gathered traditional objects from houses in the village. So again, this shows that there are local interests that can be tapped into in different ways for this kind of work. Okay, so we are now just getting ready. Actually, we've drawn up a plan. This was approved by the Sudanese Department of Antiquities for what this Heritage Center will look like. And my own current work is focused on trying to figure out how to make this self-sustaining after we leave. So, so while this work has been really rewarding, it also has a lot of elements that archaeologists are just not trained for. This is basically starting a small business. But I think we have a good line of attack. We formed a board of directors, I guess one thing that's working in our favor is the very low local wages. We've been told very firmly by locals that we are not to pay more than about $70 a month for somebody who works in this center. And so I've worked out the math that if we can figure out how to raise about $3,000 a year, that will keep this center running. And I think between a donation box, gift shop, restaurant, and some local tours, I think we'll be able to do that just fine. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about what the benefits of this entire project have been for all of us. So of course, site protection does turn out to be one of the benefits. With the local community more engaged, they are now actively policing the site, whereas in earlier years we had a problem every year with new graffiti appearing on structures that we'd excavated, particularly the underground temple. That has now stopped. I'm not sure it has stopped forever, but it has stopped for now. It has also developed a further level of trust in the village. And at the end of the winter of this last season, in winter of 2018, a man in the village showed up with two grocery bags that contained these ancient objects that he had found, that had been found in a house in the village. Not his house. This was somebody sent as a messenger. And the messenger said that the homeowner had found 5 burials and had dug into one of them, and it contained these objects as well as a lot of bones in place. This means that unlike all the burials in the royal cemetery, these are undisturbed ancient burials. And of course, I will tell you, these objects are precisely the date of the royal cemetery. So what we had been looking for all along is there in the village. So the reason that there was this elaborate system where it wasn't the person who found the stuff, they sent somebody else with the material, was that they were afraid that the Antiquities Department would come and evict them from their homes for having found that. That's not how Sudanese antiquities law works, but they were concerned, and yet they trusted us enough to start the conversation by showing us these. And I think honestly that if we hadn't done all of this work to build trust, we would never have seen that these had been found. They wouldn't initially tell me which house they had been found in. That was pretty frustrating. But we worked out a deal that as I was leaving the site for the last time for the year, they would point out the house across the village. And I said, well, okay, and so I hope that your family will talk over the course of this next year, and we'll see if we can work out a deal that I could excavate this. You get some compensation, and nobody will take your house. So I'm really hoping that that will come to pass. So this is not, there's, in all of this work, there's no question of, in working in a post-colonial way, of undoing global systems of inequality. That's just not a realistic goal. So it's not completely a collaboration of equals in some fundamental senses, but it can be a full partnership with each side bringing resources, experience, knowledge that the other does not. And I'll end with this very happy picture of two of the young boys who live in the house that we rent during the course of the season. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.